Shalom. This week we begin the second book of the Torah, the second of the 5 books of Moshe, the book of Exodus, known properly in Hebrew as Sefer Shemot, the book of names. Each person has a name, and each person is taken out of Egypt by name. Now this book begins with the Egyptian exile, which itself was none other, everything that the people of Israel had to go through was none other than a preparation for the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Everything now is leading up to the Sinai revelation, and this book, the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, it's about a preparation for Torah, about the receiving of Torah, and thus the receiving of our divine manifesto, our obligation towards humanity, and ultimately about preparing a place for the service of Hashem, which is really a home for Torah. That's the whole book of Exodus. But as of now, we begin to read dark days. Dark days indeed are beginning for the people of Israel. Now this new king, who knew not Yosef, said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel, people of the children of Israel are more numerous and stronger than we are. Come, let us outsmart them, lest they increase. And if a war befall us, they join our enemies and depart from the land." So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built store cities for Pharaoh, Pitom and Ramses. But as much as they would afflict them, so did they multiply, and so did they gain strength. And the Egyptians were disgusted because of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians enslaved the children of Israel with backbreaking labor, and they embittered their lives with hard labor, with clay and with bricks and with all kinds of labor in the fields. All their work that they worked with them was with backbreaking labor. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on between the lines about how the Egyptian leadership won the confidence of the Israelites, manipulated them, and ultimately succeeded in controlling them. There's a lot to learn here. These words, which we just read in these few sparse words in the beginning of our Parsha, they describe the beginning of what arguably, I think, is the first recorded, state-sponsored, institutionalized enslavement of an entire people. Then, these next words, we read, "And he said to the midwives, when you deliver the Hebrew women, and you see on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, she may live." But then the midwives did not do according to what Pharaoh said because they feared God, right? So then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born of the Israelites you shall cast into the Nile, and every daughter you shall allow to live." These words depict, if I'm not mistaken, the first recorded, state-sponsored, planned, and executed genocide, or more specifically, infanticide of a nation. And again, between these lines, our sages teach that this was a well-oiled machinery of calculated physical bondage and torture, psychological warfare, and ultimately mass murder. Now this Parsha, again, itself, the introduction to the Egyptian exile and everything that that represents, including the seemingly endless recurrent theme of Israel's exile amongst the nations, our Parsha opens with a description of the very existential threat that the nation of Israel faced. And what we're reading here was a challenge just to give birth. It was a challenge just for a baby to come into this world. And then it was a challenge just to live. And then it was a challenge just to survive. This was the reality at the time of the birth of Moshe. You know, here in Israel, as the current wave of terror attacks continues unabated, we have occasion to speak openly and plainly in our society about the concept of the indoctrination of children in hatred and their participation in acts of terror. And we have the opportunity to consider and try to understand this horrible phenomena. Young Muslim children as young as 13 years old have been involved in deadly knife wielding and stoning terror attacks and have committed murder. The issue goes far beyond the questions of indoctrination and incitement. The main question for those who raise their children to hate or would use them as weapons of terror is, what is your attitude altogether towards your own children? What kind of life do you want for your children? What are you teaching them, and what do you want for their lives? There's an amazing teaching on this week's Torah portion, and this is why I bring this subject up, which is somewhat of an aside, but it is just gives me pause, and it causes one to reflect on this idea in such a stark and vivid way, because the Midrash describes the Egyptians. I just saw this Midrash, I have to share it with you. The Midrash describes that the Egyptians would take their little children from school, and this is word for word, they took them out of school, send them into the Israelite homes on various pretenses to spy on them. They would bring back reports of which women were pregnant and how big they were, approximate their carrying their due dates, so that when they would come to full term and deliver, the Egyptians would return and find the babies in order to kill the males once the women delivered. And when the babies were born, the women would hide them, hide the infants. But then again, the language of the Midrash is very specific. The Egyptians would send their own children into the homes, but first they would make them cry. They would bite them or pinch them, make them cry, so that when the Jewish child, so the Midrash says, when the Jewish child would hear his friend cry, the Egyptian baby, then he would also begin to cry. And then the Egyptians would take both their own child and the Jewish child, throw them both into the river. That's how they had some sort of GPS for finding the Jewish children. Onto this surrealistic, nightmarish scene, when hope seems far away, enters Moshe. So who is Moshe? The deliverer of Israel. How did he become the man that he became? You know, we don't learn all that much about him in this Torah portion, but from this point on, with the exception of one Torah portion, Tevet, which is a whole other story, where his name is not mentioned, other than that, in every single Torah portion from this point on until the end of the book of Deuteronomy, he will be with us in every Torah portion. He is like the embodiment of Torah. You know, we learned in the book of Bereshit that the patriarch Yitzchak, Isaac, almost didn't live at all. His very life was a miracle. Abraham and Sarah were themselves incapable of having children. And later, after his miraculous birth, Yitzchak actually, according to tradition, was burnt on the altar, even though Abraham was told not to slaughter him, and he didn't, but Yitzchak had some sort of heart attack, and he did perish, and he was burnt on the altar, but then he came back. That's a long story. This is not the place. But the point is, that's the foot that the Jewish people got off on, so to speak. Not exactly within the parameters of this world. Teaching us something like maybe this is not exactly our place, or at the very least, our roots are not here. Yitzchak was not even supposed to be here, and then his outrageous situation, how do we fit into that? King David, the sweet psalmist of Israel, the very soul of Mashiach, he also almost didn't live at all, as is well known. He wouldn't have had a life were it not for Adam, who bequeathed him 70 years of his own life as a gift. This is a pattern. Now, in a way, like Yitzchak and like David, Moshe also almost didn't live at all. This we learn from the simple words in the beginning of chapter 2. A man went from the house of Levi and took a daughter of Levi. What is that all about? And then we continue reading. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw him that he was good, whatever that means, we'll soon see, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she took for him a reed basket, smeared it with clay and pitch, placed the child into it, put it into the marsh at the Nile's edge. The background here is a question that all of Israel faced: how to deal with Pharaoh's decree of annihilation against the Jewish baby boys. Amram, Moshe's father was a great man and acknowledged as a leader, and his opinion was held in high regard. So the way he saw fit to deal with Pharaoh's decree was to go ahead and divorce his wife, Yocheved. Can't bring children into this world, right? And since he acted in this manner, everybody else listened to him, and all the Jews went and likewise began to divorce their wives so that no children will be brought into the world. But their little daughter, Miriam, had a prophecy that her as yet unborn brother was going to deliver the Jewish people. And little girl that she was, she confronted her father and told him, you know, you're worse than Pharaoh. Your decree is worse than his, because for he only decreed against the males, and you're decreeing against both the males and the females. He only decreed against this world. You're decreeing against both worlds. Anyway, Amram changed his mind. And indeed, Moshe was born. And then this Moses, he was raised not only as an outsider, but in the very belly of the beast, in the palace of Pharaoh, by none other than Pharaoh's own daughter. Who's writing this script? What an unbelievable story. Who was she? She's called Bitya, literally the daughter of God. How did she merit this? You know, it's interesting, there are two indications, very small indications, of how things are sometimes measured can both be found in this parsha. And it's noteworthy because sometimes it's the smallest gesture that is the greatest measure. So when Bitya was strolling along the river's edge, chapter 2 and verse 5, we read, Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe by the river, and her maidens walked along the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maidservant, and she took it. But the word here in Hebrew, vatishlach et amata, which we're translating as maidservant, can also mean that she stretched out her arm. Sages have a phenomenal tradition here that she was not standing very close at all to the riverbank. And she stretched out her arm, and miraculously it just became, she became like, remember Gumby? It became like, there must be a modern Marvel or DC hero, I'm not up on that, but so she stretched out her arm and she was able to grab the baby. This is not literal. This is about a person who is motivated to do good. And it's maybe she wasn't close enough to reach the baby. Maybe it's like a person is in a life-threatening situation, they have a rush of adrenaline, they have an unfound physical strength. Whatever it means, the idea is that the sages are not giving us a wives' tale, they're not giving us something ridiculous. She did what she could, and it was enough. She was able, because she cared, because she was a good person, because she was motivated, because she saw this child. And that is equivalent to her arm stretching some incredible distance. And so too, Moshe himself, in chapter 3 and verse 4. And the two incidents are related. Chapter 3 and verse 4, Moshe is shepherding the sheep of Jethro, his father-in-law, far into the wilderness because he didn't want to, God forbid, have the sheep steal from anyone else's property. And all of a sudden, an angel appears to him, and Moshe says to himself, I will turn aside now and look at this great sight. Why is the bush not burned? And then we read in verse 4, Hashem saw that he turned aside to see, and God called out to him. That's the beginning of their relationship. When Hashem saw that he turned aside to see, Hashem called out to him. That began the relationship that God had with Moshe, the person with whom he was closer than anyone else. And the Talmud discusses, what does it mean that Moshe turned his head? One opinion is that he actually walked a few feet, and the other is all he did was just turn his head. And that was enough. And this is also not a simple thing, but what's being emphasized here is that a person has to make an effort. It has to come from within. A person has to want. And that's what makes all the difference. And of all the amazing things that we eventually will learn about Moshe, the deliverer of Israel, about his humility, about what he became, how he was able to commune with God on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights without eating or drinking, how God himself was to testify later that he was faithful throughout his entire house and how he was the humblest man on earth. But until he reached his high level, not a great deal is said about him. In Parashat Va'era, later on, there's more, there's genealogy, but right now, in this Torah portion, we don't learn a lot about him. And what we really know about him is told very simply, and actually, everything that the Torah wants to teach us, and this is open up your heart, the deepest lesson in the world, everything the Torah wants to teach us about Moshe is actually in this verse that we already quoted, which is, a man went from the house of Levi, and he took a daughter of Levi, and the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. Exactly. Because, you know, he was born of a woman, regular person, as opposed to the greats of mythology, sons of gods. There's a lot of this stuff going around. Other founders of religions that are human or superhuman or whatever. The Torah makes it plain that a person can become as great as Moshe from the bottom up and not the other way around. And this is just such an unbelievable thing. You know who this person becomes? Moshe. And the first thing that we hear about him is that Amram went and remarried Yocheved, and Moshe was born. To be born naturally and to use our humanity, our powers to elevate our nature to its godly source. Moshe's greatness didn't come from his lineage. The Torah is not something that can be acquired by inheritance. And not only this, but he grew up and was educated in Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh goes and decrees destruction on all the males, and the one who is going to be saving them is growing up in his own house, raised by his daughter, sitting on his adopted grandfather's knee, who's kissing him, and he's playing with his crown. This is bizarre. And there's a lot of lessons here for us, the lesson of history, that we only see what we see. The deliverance is already there, and Hashem has his plan. And after we're told that he's being raised by Pharaoh's daughter, there are three basic stories that are told in fairly rapid succession in this parsha. There's the killing of the Egyptian, and there's a long story there again between the lines about an Egyptian taskmaster who basically raped the wife of one of the Israelites and then was tormenting that Israelite in the field. That's the Egyptian that Moshe killed. The two men that were fighting, who had some involvement in that story as well, who were ready to tattle on Moshe. And the daughters of Midian, whom Moshe saved. These things are not told because of the chronological integrity. They're not told because of the timeline, the sequence. They're told because of what they teach us about Moshe. Because these are the only things that we need to know that indicate to us, in addition to his birth, that indicate to us what led up to the great task of him becoming a prophet. In fact, what's actually incredible when we read the verses is that in chapter 2, we read that Pharaoh's daughter adopted him. She, his own sister says, "Shall I go and summon for you a witness?" Daughter of Pharaoh says, "Go." She's raising him. She named him, the daughter of Pharaoh named him Moses, and she said, "For I drew him from the water." And then, not in the next chapter, but in the next verse, in chapter 2, in verse 10, she names him. And in verse 11, it happened in those days that Moshe grew up and went out to his brethren. Could I know something about his growing up? Could I know anything? Nothing. Fast forward and observe their burdens. He was growing up in Pharaoh's house like a prince. And he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew man of his brethren. First thing that we find out about him is that he went out and he observed the suffering of his brethren. And there's so much going on here, there's so much tradition that we can learn. But all we're actually told in the verses is that he went out to see their suffering. But the light that Moshe is to become is already present. When he was born, we read in chapter 2, the woman conceived and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was good, and she hid him for 3 months. So we are taught, what does it mean that she saw that he was good? The house filled up with light when he was born. I have to tell you, let's not wax mystical. That's always a last resort. You know what it really means, the house filled up with light? It's not necessary for us to give this any interpretation other than the real interpretation. Because Moshe wasn't a god, or the son of a god, any more than any other person. Moshe was a person. He overcame a lot. You know why the house filled up with light? Because it was the light of his own potential that he was to achieve. No wonder he was the deliverer. This person who grew up under these circumstances in the heart of darkness, and no wonder he is practically synonymous with Torah itself, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our master, because he is the proof that a person can fill the house up with light, can become anything and overcome anything and truly merit closeness to God. And it's through our own efforts, and not in spite of, but because of our own humanity. That's how we will truly merit the great and ultimate redemption. And that's how we can truly merit, each and every one of us, never again to return to Egypt.